This episode, we will be going over the post-war period in Africa and the Middle East. Check out our episode on New Imperialism to see Africa during the last period, and our early 20th century video for the making of the Middle East. In Africa, the Second World War made it clear that colonization was no longer in the cards for European powers. They were exhausted from the war, both economically and militarily, and the two new dominant powers, the United States and Soviet Union, promoted decolonization efforts. In the British and French colonies, reforms allowed black Africans to become administrators, either through elections or appointments. But the more minor colonial powers at the time, Belgium and Portugal, were less proactive in their decolonization plans. Colonial rule brought with it some improvements, like better transportation, medical, and communication systems, but these were often utilized by a minority of more prosperous Africans. For the time being, though, most Africans were still living in severely poor conditions. Many worked on plantations exporting crops or extracting Africa's vast mineral wealth. Most of the profits were siphoned out of Africa, either to Europe or to their possessions in India and the Middle East. Even those Africans who stayed out of colonial affairs were forced to vacate the best farming land, which was held in reserve for European settlers. Though the era of new imperialism was kicked into high gear in the 1880s, the quest for native rights ramped up after World War I, with the establishment of political organizations aiming to improve life for Africans. The Pan-African Congress aimed to unite people of African descent globally to fight colonialism and discrimination. The first Congress met in 1919, followed by several others that influenced African nationalist movements. In the west of the continent was the National Congress of British West Africa, founded in 1917 in the Gold Coast, before spreading to Nigeria, Sierra Leone, and Gambia. In Eastern Africa was the Kikuyu Central Association, founded in 1924 in colonial Kenya, advocating for the colony's largest ethnic group. In the south was the African National Congress, or ANC, founded to oppose racial segregation and promote the rights of black South Africans. After World War II, these organizations transitioned into legitimate political parties, no longer just seeking reform, but independence. Kwame Nkrumah started the first of these. He split from Dankwa and their movement, the United Gold Coast Convention, which was composed largely of wealthy professionals, businessmen, and traditional elites, who advocated for gradual constitutional reforms and collaboration with the British colonial government to achieve self-governance. The contrast was immediately seen in the slogan of self-government now, as opposed to the UGCC's slogan of self-government in the shortest time possible. In the East, the Kenya African Union was founded in 1944, as the successor to the KCA, which had been banned by the British in 1940. It was led by Jomo Kenyatta from 1947. The KAU took a more moderate stance initially, advocating for African representation in government and the return of alienated lands, but faced growing pressure as grassroots frustrations intensified. In 1952, an insurgency turned into a full-scale war, the Mau Mau Rebellion. It spawned from a militant movement primarily involving the Kikuyu and was later joined by other people seeking to reclaim stolen lands and achieve self-rule, what was called uhuru, or freedom. The most brutal phase lasted until 1956, but violence would continue until 1960. There were an estimated 12,000 to 30,000 deaths, mostly on the side of the rebels. Though the British were victorious, the economic strain paved the way for Kenya's eventual independence and demonstrated the unsustainability of colonial rule. South Africa took a different path. The descendants of the Boers, or Afrikaners, grew their own sense of nationalism in the face of British cultural dominance. Broederbond, a secret Afrikaner organization, promoted Afrikaner culture, language, and political goals, and in 1948, the Afrikaner-led National Party won the general election, marking a significant shift in South African politics. the NP implemented apartheid, a system designed to entrench Afrikaner supremacy and Afrikaner cultural dominance. Afrikaans replaced English as the dominant language in government and public institutions. But the ANC, the nationalist group seeking reform, was still around and saw this as a major setback. But the quickest change came in North Africa. After being an Italian colony, Libya was the first African nation to gain post-war independence through the United Nations. King Idris ruled as a constitutional monarch supported by Britain and the US, with a government centered in Tripoli and Benghazi. Nearby, French Algeria had been colonized and later became a jurisdiction of France.
Algiers, a busy piece of metropolitan France transplanted across the Mediterranean. Frenchmen have lived and ruled here since 1830. More than 1 million Frenchmen in Algiers rub elbows with more than 10 million Muslims. Man on horseback, symbol of France, stands in Algiers' main square. On the surface, Muslim and Frenchman live well together. They shop in the same stores.
But what lay deeper? As hundreds of thousands of Europeans settled there, the native Muslim community started fighting for economic freedom and political sovereignty. On May 8, 1945, the day the World War ended in Europe, protests for independence clashed with victory celebrations, and the protesters were violently suppressed by French authorities. Over 20,000 Algerians were killed in subsequent reprisals, fueling nationalist sentiment. It became clear that peaceful reform under French rule was unlikely, setting the stage for armed struggle. On All Saints' Day, 1954, the National Liberation Front launched a coordinated armed uprising known as the Toussaint Rouge. Both sides engaged in brutal tactics, including guerrilla warfare, urban bombings, and harsh counterinsurgency by the French military. This act launched the Algerian War of Independence. The infamous Battle of Algiers was a pivotal moment and marked the French army's first decisive victory in the war, and gained them popularity with the settlers. But later revelations revealed extensive use of torture and illegal executions, shifting support towards Algerian independence. When de Gaulle became president of the newly established Fifth Republic, which we went over last episode, he initially reassured French settlers and military leaders that Algeria would remain part of France during a speech in Algiers in 1958, but by 1959, de Gaulle recognized that maintaining Algeria as a French colony was unsustainable due to the high cost and domestic condemnation. In September 1959, de Gaulle proposed the principle of self-determination, signaling a major policy shift. This move alienated the French settlers and military leaders who felt betrayed. After 8 years of war, France and the FLN negotiated the Evian Accords, granting Algeria independence on July 5, 1962. Algerian independence marked a major victory in global anti-colonial movements. The FLN then established a one-party socialist state, led by President Ahmed Ben Bella. During Algeria's war, the dominoes started to fall in other regions of North Africa, as Tunisia became independent in 1956, and exiled Sultan Mohammed V returned to Morocco in the same year. In the rest of Africa, the Gold Coast became independent in 1957 under Kwame Nkrumah, and was renamed as Ghana. Nigeria, another British colony, became independent soon after, followed by the Belgian Congo. Tanganyika gained independence in 1961, and Zanzibar in 1963 as a constitutional monarchy. But the island experienced a violent revolution in 1964, overthrowing the Sultanate and creating a republic. Tanganyika and Zanzibar then united to form the United Republic of Tanzania in 1964. Ethiopia, under Emperor Haile Selassie, had endured Italian occupation during the war, and remained one of the few African nations to maintain sovereignty during the colonial era. British and Italian Somaliland both achieved independence in 1960, uniting to form the Somali Republic. French West African and Equatorial colonies mostly became independent in 1960, which became known as the Year of Africa. It wasn't until the 1970s that the Portuguese colonies gained their independence, after a military coup in Portugal installed a democratic government. After independence, Western presence was still largely felt in the cities and large urban centers, where Africans who had been trained or educated in the West promoted democratic models of government. They took differing economic paths though, with many following a capitalist system, like in Kenya and Zaire, while other leaders, like in Ghana or Tanzania, integrated their own communal African systems with socialism. Africa is a strikingly large continent and the most diverse on Earth, with over 3,000 ethnic groups and over 2,000 distinct languages. Africa is also home to 5 major language groups and is even religiously diverse, with Christianity, Islam, and syncretic religions all exerting significant influence. This made the traditional idea of the nation-state a challenge. Some came to embrace the idea of a more continental unity, called Pan-Africanism. In May 1963, in Ethiopia, 32 modern states signed on to the Organization of African Unity, or the OAU. Its foundation was on the basis of equality, freedom, and territorial integrity, aiming to stamp out the vestiges of colonialism. But European economic power lingered. This was known as neo-colonialism. Many African economies were designed during colonialism to extract raw materials for export to the former colonial powers. After independence, this export-oriented economic model persisted, leaving economies vulnerable to fluctuations in global commodity prices and limiting domestic industrialization. The lack of diversified economies meant that state revenues were concentrated in a few sectors, such as mineral mining and agriculture. North Africa was blessed with something more. In 1959, the discovery of oil transformed Libya from one of the world's poorest nations into a resource-rich state. Revenues flowed into the monarchy but exacerbated inequality and corruption, fueling discontent. The king was seen as out of touch with Libya's younger, more nationalist population. In 1969, Colonel Gaddafi seized power in a bloodless coup on September 1, overthrowing King Idris. His rule spanned decades and defined Libya's modern history. Fueled by a pan-Arabist wave, his early efforts were to merge Libya with Egypt, Sudan, and Syria, but he failed due to differences with other leaders. Gaddafi introduced his ideological framework, the Green Book, advocating for a unique system of direct democracy called the Jamahiriya, or People's Authority. In 1977, he took on the permanent role of brotherly leader, as the Libyan Republic was replaced with a socialist dictatorship, centralizing power and suppressing dissent. Gaddafi supported different liberation movements and international terrorist organizations, ostracizing Libya from the West. The post-independence period also saw Africa mixed up in the Cold War, as they came in the middle of the competition between Washington and Moscow.
Reconnaissons avec joie et émotion que le Congo accède ce 30 juin 1960 en plein accord avec la Belgique à l'indépendance et à la souveraineté internationale.
The Congo negotiated its independence in 1960, but left behind a poor political system for Prime Minister Patrice Lumumba, a pro-Soviet nationalist. With Belgian and American support, the mineral-rich province of Katanga broke away in July, aligning itself with the West. When Lumumba sought Soviet aid to reintegrate the province, he was overthrown in a coup led by Joseph Mobutu, later Mobutu Sese Seko, backed by the US and Belgium. Mobutu had him sent to Katanga, where he was tortured and executed by firing squad. After his death, his body was dismembered and dissolved in acid to prevent it from becoming a symbol of resistance. Despite this, he has become a martyr and figure of the Pan-African cause. In collaboration with the UN, Mobutu helped to reintegrate Katanga into the Congo, significantly increasing his influence. By 1965, he had enough power to dismiss both the president and prime minister, declaring himself the sole head of state. By 1971, he declared the Congo to be a one-party state and renamed it Zaire. Mobutu fostered a cult of personality, adopting the title Mobutu Sese Seko, meaning the all-powerful warrior. Zaire, and Congo before it, remained in his control for over 3 decades. Most African nations decided to take a neutral stance, joining the non-aligned movement during the 60s and 70s, siding with neither the United States or Soviet Union, but they each governed their nations differently. Some, like Tanzania under Julius Nyerere, promoted socialism through the Arusha Declaration in 1967, outlining the principles of ujamaa, or fraternity, claiming African societies were inherently socialist.
What is an ujamaa village, and how important is this to the goals of the Arusha Declaration?
Well, it is very important. We are saying that a society, or what you call modern development, is a result of people working together. Anything you call development is a result of people working together. People can work together in 2 ways. They can work together for another. In slavery, they work together for another. In capitalism, they work together for another. Both of these methods do produce something you can call development. But they can also work together for themselves. And we are saying, in our case, we are not going to cut the idea, the thing, development, by working together for another. We are going to work together for ourselves. And we are creating these communities we call ujamaa villages. Ujamaa is the word we use for socialism. We are going to use these ujamaa or socialist villages for the purpose of working together for our own good.
He maintained a one-party system and established village collectives to avoid economic inequality. Surprising to many Western observers, Tanzania appeared to experience less internal conflict, less ethnic tension, and less instability than other African nations. But this wasn't to last, as many of Nyerere's long-term goals failed, and he resigned in 1985, admitting his failure in creating the Afro-socialist state he envisioned.
We did not have to nationalize everything. We did not have, it's one thing to nationalize land, which is the truth in Tanzania. Land in Tanzania is public. It's a very different thing to nationalize farms. And we went to things like nationalizing little things like farms. That was a mistake.
Although Tanzania achieved great success through its universal healthcare and education, Nyerere admitted that Tanzania's economy did not prosper under his leadership, and his programs failed to boost agricultural productivity, while the collectivization was widely resisted by farmers. Nyerere's resignation marked the end of an era but not the end of his influence, and the CCM is still the dominant ruling party in the country. Just over the northern border was Kenya, which took a different path, instead implementing capitalism. Jomo Kenyatta, Kenya's first president, prioritized economic growth and stability, and unlike his southern neighbor, favored capitalism as a means to achieve these goals. With more fertile highlands, Kenya had a significantly higher European presence during the colonial era, around 70,000 to Tanzania's 15, and had been the recipient of more foreign investment. Kenyatta himself came from a background that valued private property, and his policies reflected a preference for wealth accumulation through free enterprise. While Kenyatta promoted community self-help initiatives under the banner of Harambee, Swahili for pulling together, these complemented rather than replaced the capitalist framework. Kenyatta died in office in 1978 and was succeeded by Daniel Arap Moi, who was a more authoritarian leader and has been investigated for human rights abuses and corruption. He stayed in power until 2002, Kenya's longest-serving president. Also in East Africa, Ethiopia and Somalia took diverging paths during the 1960s. Haile Selassie's state experienced relative stability but faced increasing unrest. The annexation of Eritrea in 1962 triggered the Eritrean War of Independence, which would persist for decades. In Somalia, a parliamentary democracy emerged after independence but struggled with clan-based rivalries and governance challenges. In 1969, President Abdi Rashid Ali Sharmak was assassinated, and General Siad Barre seized power in a coup. Barre implemented a scientific socialist regime, aligning Somalia with the Soviet Union. His government promoted Somali nationalism, focusing on uniting all Somali-speaking peoples, a vision that would soon lead to war with Ethiopia. But this Ethiopia was under new leadership and had strong allies. The Derg had overthrown Selassie in 1974 in a bloody coup, assassinating the emperor. Aligning with the Soviet Union, the Derg created a socialist state, centralizing control and implementing land reforms. But they soon faced an invasion on their eastern borders. The Ogaden War marked a critical turning point for both nations. Somalia invaded the Ogaden in Ethiopia, seeking to annex it and unite its Somali-speaking people. Initially, Somali forces made gains, but Ethiopia, backed by Cuban troops and Soviet military support, repelled the invasion. The war devastated Somalia's economy and weakened Barre's regime, while the Ethiopian Derg regime faced mounting internal strife. By the early 1990s, both Ethiopia and Somalia experienced profound political upheavals. After a tumultuous decade of war, famine, and a violent repression campaign that could have killed up to almost 1 million, the Derg failed to hold onto the country. The Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front, a coalition of rebel groups, ousted the Derg regime in 1991. This victory led to the independence of Eritrea in 1993 and the establishment of Ethiopia's federal system, emphasizing ethnic autonomy. But ethnic tensions persisted, particularly among the Tigray, Oromo, and Amhara, leading to periodic violence. Somalia, meanwhile, descended into chaos. Barre's regime collapsed in 1991, leaving Somalia fragmented into clan-based factions. The North declared independence as Somaliland, while other regions, such as Puntland, operated autonomously. The absence of a central government led to widespread conflict, famine, and the rise of warlords. International interventions, including the United Nations and US-led missions, failed to stabilize the country. The turn of the millennium saw ongoing instability in the Horn of Africa, as Ethiopia had recently plunged into civil war, while Somalia struggled to rebuild a functional state among clan rivalries. In South Africa, the Afrikaner government continued to rule through their policy of apartheid. But the ANC also continued their efforts for change. They helped draft the Freedom Charter in 1955, envisioning a democratic, non-racial South Africa, and became the ideological foundation of the ANC struggle. Nelson Mandela rose to prominence as an ANC leader, but by the late 1950s he was viewed as a dangerous agitator, and was arrested multiple times. After the Sharpeville massacre in 1960, where police killed 69 peaceful protesters, the ANC was banned by the government. South Africa had remained a dominion of the British Empire since 1910, but the Afrikaner National Party broke from Britain in 1961 after a referendum, and South Africa became an independent republic, entrenching the white minority rule.
There are many people who feel that it is useless and futile for us to continue talking peace and non-violence against a government whose reply is only savage attacks on an unarmed and defenseless people. And I think the time has come for us to consider, in the light of our experiences in this stay at home, whether the methods which we have applied so far are adequate.
Mandela and others concluded that non-violent methods were insufficient to counter apartheid. In 1961, they formed the MK, the ANC's armed wing, to carry out acts of sabotage against government infrastructure. In 1962, Mandela was arrested and sentenced to 5 years in prison for leaving South Africa illegally and inciting strikes. In 1964, while serving this sentence, Mandela and other MK leaders were tried in the Rivonia trial, charged with sabotage and conspiracy to overthrow the government. Mandela was sentenced to life imprisonment and sent to Robben Island, where he remained for 27 years. The racial segregation policies continued, with black Africans being forced to live in impoverished conditions on poor land, called Bantustans. But there was a growing international movement that put pressure on the National Party, and after foreign investment stopped, President Frederick de Klerk released Mandela from imprisonment in 1990. 1994 marked a historic milestone, as the first multiracial democratic elections were held in the country, with the ANC winning a majority and Nelson Mandela becoming president. During the election, a new flag was adopted, using elements from the Union Jack, Dutch flag, and colors of the ANC. In 1996, the new constitution formally made South Africa a multiracial state, enshrining human rights and equality. In 1999, Mandela chose not to seek a second term and stepped down from the presidency, but the ANC remained in power well into the new millennium. In the rest of Southern Africa, Southern Rhodesia joined Northern Rhodesia and Nyasaland to form the Central African Federation in 1953, aiming to unite and maintain white settler control. Due to African nationalist movements, the federation collapsed in 1963, leading to the independence of Zambia and Malawi a year later. But Southern Rhodesia, now unofficially just known as Rhodesia, remained under British rule. But in 1965, under Prime Minister Ian Smith, Rhodesia's white minority government declared independence from Britain to avoid transitioning to majority rule. This sparked the nationalist organizations, ZANU and ZAPU, into a long guerrilla war. In 1980, after 15 years of war, independence was negotiated, with Robert Mugabe becoming the first Prime Minister of Zimbabwe. Mugabe's early policies focused on reconciliation and development, but political repression and economic challenges soon emerged.
See if people are as jubilant this time next year.
I feel sick. That's all I can say.
Are you going to stay in Rhodesia?
I don't think so.
Where will you go?
I go to Britain, in spite of the weather.
A little worried. I'm hopeful that this will sort of stop the war. If it stops the war, then I'd live under any conditions, quite honestly. The war has been dreadful. I lost my husband. I have 3 children to support. I am worried because if he should nationalise, as has been said, I stand to lose everything.
No, actually, I'm not too happy about it at all, because, he's been responsible for, his men have been responsible for lots of atrocities, in this country. And also, he is a communist.
Southwest Africa came under South African control after the German loss in the First World War, as part of the UN mandate system. As in South Africa, a system of apartheid was implemented in the old German colony. But opposition grew, leading to the formation of liberation movements like the Southwest Africa People's Organization to fight for an independent Namibia. After the UN revoked the mandate, South Africa still refused to relinquish it. SWAPO then launched a guerrilla war and became embroiled in a larger conflict once South Africa invaded Angola to prevent communist governance. Independence was finally achieved in 1990 after decades of struggle and international pressure. Namibia's independence from South Africa marked the end of one of the longest liberation struggles in the region. In Western Africa, Nigeria faced its own difficulties with division. It achieved total independence in 1960 and became a republic in 1963, adopting a constitution with a ceremonial president as head of state and prime minister as the head of government. This wasn't to last, as a series of coups brought about different periods of military rule. Nigeria's ethnic and religious divisions defined politics, with major parties representing the Hausa Fulani in the north, the Igbo, or Igbo, in the southeast, and the Yoruba in the southwest. Ethnic violence and political marginalization led the eastern region to declare independence as the Republic of Biafra in 1967, under the leadership of Chukwuemeka Odumegwu Ojukwu. The ensuing civil war claimed over 1 million lives, primarily due to famine and disease. The war ended in 1970 with Biafra's defeat.
The so-called rising sun of Biafra is set forever.
Nigerian head of state, Yakubu Gowon's message of "No victor, no vanquished" fostered internal peace and reconciliation. The capital was moved from Lagos, in the Yoruba-dominated west, to Abuja, in the inner part of the country. Military rule continued on and off for decades. The last of these rulers was General Sani Abacha, who seized power in 1993. But Abacha died suddenly in 1998, and there was now a path toward a democratic transition. Olusegun Obasanjo was elected president in 1999, marking Nigeria's return to civilian rule. Lagos, the former capital, remains the largest urban area in Africa, with 21 million inhabitants and ranks 6th largest in the world. Religious differences between the majority Muslim North and Christian South continue. After World War I, part of German East Africa was given to Belgium as a mandate, Rwanda-Urundi. Rwanda-Urundi was comprised of 3 major ethnic groups, the 2 most prominent being the Hutu and the Tutsi. Belgium institutionalized ethnic divisions between the Tutsi minority, who were traditionally cattle herders, and the Hutu majority, who were primarily agriculturalists. Colonial policies favored the Tutsi elite, providing them with better education and political privileges, deepening resentment among the Hutu population. In 1959, ethnic tensions erupted into violence during the Rwandan Revolution. Tutsi elites faced massacres, and many fled to neighboring countries. Rwanda gained independence on July 1, 1962, with Gregoire Kayibanda as its first president, establishing Hutu-led governance. Burundi, where the Tutsi elite maintained power, also gained independence on the same day. In a grim foreshadowing, the Tutsi-dominated army and government committed a series of mass killings on the Hutu after an uprising, resulting in 100,000 to 300,000 deaths. The Akiza, as it was known, translates to the Great Calamity, or catastrophe. Rwanda, on the other hand, became a Hutu-dominated republic, with the Tutsi minority marginalized and subjected to periodic violence. After the Hutu Revolution, a group of Tutsi refugees fled to Uganda, founding the Rwandan Patriotic Front, or RPF. In 1990, they launched an invasion into Rwanda under Paul Kagame, triggering the Rwandan Civil War. This brought harsh pushback, as Hutu military and militias planned for widespread violence, and radio stations dehumanized the Tutsi and incited hatred. After a long stalemate, a peace agreement was signed between the RPF and Rwandan government, calling for a power-sharing arrangement. But extremist Hutu factions, unhappy with the accords, began planning something even worse than war. On April 6, 1994, the president's plane was shot down, killing him and the Burundian president. The assassination, blamed on the RPF by Hutu extremists, served as a trigger for what became known as the Rwandan genocide. Extremist Hutu militias, the most prominent being the Interahamwe, began a systematic genocide of Tutsi civilians and moderate Hutus. Over the next 100 days, 800,000 to 1 million people, predominantly Tutsi, were killed by Interahamwe militias and Hutu extremists. In July 1994, Paul Kagame and the RPF captured Kigali and ousted the Hutu government, putting an end to the civil war and genocide. Millions of Hutu refugees, including former genocidaires, fled to neighboring countries, particularly into eastern Zaire. These refugee camps became bases for cross-border attacks into Rwanda, destabilizing the region. But with the end of the Cold War, the West stopped supporting Zaire, and Mobutu's declining control had little power in the East. His weakened grip on his country presented an opportunity for Rwanda and Uganda to install a new regime that would align with their interests and secure the region. Both nations, seeking to neutralize the threat, supported a rebellion led by Laurent Désiré Kabila against Zaire's dictator. In 1996, with the backing of his allies, Kabila launched his campaign to oust Mobutu, and his regime collapsed in 1997. Kabila declared himself president and renamed the country the Democratic Republic of the Congo. The Congo War ended Mobutu's 32-year rule but left the DRC deeply unstable. But the issue of the Hutu militias remained unresolved. In order to maintain independence, Kabila then expelled Rwandan and Ugandan advisors from the Congo, alienating many of his former allies. Those who once saw him as a liberator began to see him as an autocrat plagued by corruption, not to mention his failure to unite the country. To secure their influence in the east, Rwanda and Uganda once again backed rebel groups, this time against Kabila's government, the most prominent being the Rally for Congolese Democracy, or RCD. This Second Congo War rapidly escalated into a regional quagmire as 9 African nations were drawn in, as well as a second major Ugandan allied rebel group in the north of the Congo, the MLC. Eastern Congo became the epicenter of the conflict, with numerous atrocities committed by all sides. In 2001, Kabila was assassinated by his bodyguard, but the circumstances still remain murky. If it was a broader conspiracy to bring peace, it succeeded, as his son Joseph was installed as president and was more open to negotiation. A transitional government was established, but violence persisted in eastern Congo, fueled by ethnic militias, foreign interests, and disputes over natural resources. The Second Congo War is often called Africa's World War, resulting in the deaths of approximately 5.5 million people, primarily from disease and starvation, and it remains the deadliest conflict since World War II. Like in Europe, African nations sought to integrate their economies, and the OAU formed the African Economic Community in 1991. In 2002, the OAU transitioned into the African Union, which has a broader mandate, including economic integration and stronger institutional structures, aiming for a more peaceful and connected union. This was championed by Gaddafi, who was frustrated with the failures of Pan-Arabism and looked to promote Pan-Africanism instead, envisioning Libya as a leader in the funding of the African Union and numerous infrastructure projects across the continent. While Africa's decolonization process was driven by Pan-African unity and anti-colonial movements, the Middle East's decolonization was shaped by religion and the geopolitics surrounding the Suez Canal and the large reserve of oil. We had last left the Middle East in the period after World War I. Turkey and Iran had both modernized from the preceding Ottoman and Qajar period under Ataturk and Reza Shah, but maintained close ties to the West. The Levant and Mesopotamia came under more direct control of European powers, with the French maintaining mandates in Syria and Lebanon, and the British maintaining mandates in Transjordan and Palestine, but also holding influence in Egypt and Iraq. The end of World War II, though, brought sweeping changes to the Middle East. By 1946, French forces had withdrawn from both Lebanon and Syria. The same year, Britain negotiated the Treaty of London, recognizing Transjordan as an independent kingdom. The British mandate formally ended, and Abdullah was proclaimed king. But the mandate continued in Palestine. Jewish immigration surged in the 1920s and 30s due to persecution in Europe, particularly under the Nazi regime. By the 1930s, the demographic and economic changes caused by this influx heightened Arab fears of displacement and loss of political control. They felt betrayed by the British, as well as the wealthy Arab elite, who continued to sell land to Jewish settlers. In 1936, there was a large-scale uprising against British rule and Jewish immigration. Organized by nationalist leaders, it began with a general strike and acts of violence on Jewish settlements and quickly turned into an armed uprising against British forces. The British response was swift and brutal, as Arab fighters were mass arrested and dozens were executed. There was widespread use of collective punishment against Arab communities and the destruction of villages suspected of supporting the rebels. By 1939, the revolt was suppressed and Palestinian political leadership was decimated, as most leaders were imprisoned or fled into exile. One of these was the Grand Mufti, who later became a Nazi collaborator. In response to the revolt, the British government issued the White Paper of 1939, which limited Jewish immigration to Palestine to 75,000 over 5 years and proposed the eventual establishment of a single binational state.
Palestine Jews stage a monster demonstration to protest against the British White Paper. Behind these pictures lies the tragedy of a people dissatisfied with its lot. In Tel Aviv's great stadium, they learn that Britain wants Jews and Arabs to live together in peace, while we will guarantee each nation from domination by the other. But the Jews are not content, and disorder and lawlessness still reign in the promised land.
But with the onset of World War II, the White Paper's key provisions would never be implemented. Jewish survivors of the Holocaust sought refuge in Palestine, often arriving illegally due to British immigration restrictions. Zionist paramilitary groups, like Irgun and Haganah, intensified resistance against British control. The most infamous was the bombing of the King David Hotel, the site of the British administrative headquarters. Leahy, a more militant faction that split from Irgun, hated the British presence so much, they sought an alliance from Nazi Germany, alienating them from other Jewish groups. All this while violence between Jews and Arabs increased, with both sides engaging in attacks and reprisals. The British found it increasingly difficult to manage the escalating conflict and referred the Palestine question to the United Nations, which proposed dividing the region into 3: a Jewish state, an Arab state, and an internationally controlled Jerusalem. This partition plan was roughly based on the locations of existing Arab or Jewish-owned land and villages. This UN partition plan was adopted as Resolution 181 in 1947. Jews accepted the plan, viewing it as a step toward statehood. As this was at a time when all their neighbors had achieved independence, the Arabs rejected it, opposing the division of Palestine and the establishment of a Jewish state. The result was civil war, as Jewish and Arab communities clashed as hundreds were killed. In March, in preparation for the establishment of their new Jewish state, paramilitary troops undertook Plan Dalit, a swift targeting and capture of territory that destroyed or depopulated over 500 Arab villages. The British withdrew their forces on May 14, 1948, and at the stroke of midnight, the Jewish leadership, led by David Ben-Gurion, declared the establishment of the State of Israel as the British mandate ended. The day after Israel's declaration, the neighboring Arab states, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon, invaded, initiating the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. Egypt was a leading member of the Arab League, established in 1945 to promote Arab unity. Farouk sought to assert Egypt's leadership in the Arab world, especially in competition with other Arab leaders like King Abdullah I of Jordan, whose Arab Legion, led by British-trained forces, was seen as a rival to Egyptian influence in Palestine. But the Arab forces lacked a unified command, acting independently. The most capable, Jordan's Arab Legion, focused on securing the west bank of the Jordan River and East Jerusalem. Egyptian forces attacked from the south, aiming to advance toward Tel Aviv, while Syrian and Iraqi forces attacked from the north and east, respectively. But in contrast, the Jewish forces centralized the Haganah paramilitary group, along with members of Irgun and Leahy, into the Israeli Defense Force, or IDF. This helped with their logistics and supply chains. Soon after the start of the war, Israel acquired critical weapons and supplies from Czechoslovakia, including rifles, machine guns, and fighter planes, funded by donations from Jewish communities worldwide. This arms deal significantly enhanced Israel's military capabilities during the war. After their initial setback, Israel regrouped and launched counteroffensives, bolstered by foreign aid and mobilization of Jewish immigrants and local populations. The war resulted in an Israeli victory, and Israel expanded its territory beyond the borders proposed by the UN partition plan. The Gaza Strip came under Egyptian administration, while the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, was annexed by Jordan. The war solidified the establishment of Israel as a sovereign state, recognized by many countries, including the United States and the Soviet Union. Approximately 700 to 750,000 Palestinian Arabs, around half their population, fled or were expelled from their villages during the war, becoming refugees in neighboring Arab countries or territories. Although they were given citizenship in Jordan, refugees were unable to return home, and the right of return became a central demand for Palestinians. After an armistice, Israel focused on nation-building, absorbing Jewish immigrants from Europe and North Africa and other areas of the Middle East. But in Egypt, the war's failure, combined with King Farouk's corruption and ties with Britain, further eroded his popularity. Egypt's military officers became frustrated by his poor leadership and formed a nationalist and reform-minded group in the Free Officers Movement. On July 23, 1952, the Free Officers launched a military coup, seizing key government buildings, media outlets, and military installations. King Farouk was forced to abdicate and went into exile in Italy. In 1953, Egypt was officially declared a republic, abolishing the monarchy and aristocracy. Mohamed Naguib became the first president, but the real power behind the scenes was a man named Gamal Abdel Nasser. By 1954, Nasser sidelined Naguib and became the de facto leader, formally assuming the presidency in 1956. He quickly emerged as a charismatic leader in the Arab world, championing Arab nationalism and Pan-Arabism. Pan-Arabism is the idea of unifying Arab nations based on shared language, culture, and history. He sought to end Western imperialism in the Arab world and opposed Israel in the support of Palestinian liberation. With the monarchy abolished, it became time to get rid of the British. Though Egypt was independent, the Western power had kept a presence in Egypt and retained control of the valuable Suez Canal.
ووافقت الحكومة على القانون الآتي قرار من رئيس الجمهورية بتأميم الشركة العالمية لقناة السويس البحرية.
In 1956, Nasser nationalized the canal to assert Egypt's sovereignty and fund development projects, like the Aswan Dam. This action led to the Suez Crisis, as the British and French launched a military intervention to protect their economic interests. Nasser was vilified in the French and British press. They were aided by Israel, but the US, under President Eisenhower, opposed the intervention. Eisenhower pressured Britain, France, and Israel to withdraw by threatening economic sanctions and withholding oil supplies. As Israel had advanced into the Sinai, their withdrawal was compensated with access to the Straits of Tiran in Egyptian waters. But it was the Egyptian president who came out as the biggest victor. Nasser emerged as a hero of Arab nationalism, having successfully nationalized the canal and stood up to Western powers. Now more than ever, Nasser had the power to achieve his goals of uniting the Arab world. At this time, Syria had an unstable parliamentary democracy with a multi-party system. One of these was the Ba'ath Party, co-founded by Michel Aflaq. Syria's political instability and fear of a communist coup led Ba'ath leaders to seek union with Egypt, as they shared the vision of establishing a unified secular Arab socialist state. Talks began, and in 1958, after a referendum, both states formed a political union to become the United Arab Republic, with Nasser as its president. Nasser implemented centralization policies, merging the military, economic, and administrative systems. Many Syrians resented Egyptian dominance in the union. After Nasser's nationalizing of a number of industries, a military coup overthrew the Syrian government and ended the UAR in 1961, marking a significant blow to Nasser's pan-Arab ambitions. The Ba'athist Party took full control of Syria in 1963 in another coup, but did not revive the UAR. Nasser had planned to unite other countries like Jordan, Iraq, and Saudi Arabia, but these were monarchies, and Iraq and Saudi Arabia were especially wary of having to spread their oil wealth across the Arab world. Domestically, Nasser's Egypt had always been focused on nationalism, not Islam. Nasser cracked down on the Muslim Brotherhood, a powerful Islamist movement, after they opposed his secular policies and allegedly attempted to assassinate him in 1954. They would then operate and spread their ideas behind the scenes, but Nasser would make sure to discredit their ideology. In this speech, Nasser tells of an earlier meeting with their leader, who urged him to make the veil mandatory for all women.
قلت له يا أستاذ أنت ليك بنت في كلية الطب مش لابسة طرحة ولا حاجة ما لبستهاش طرحة ليه؟ إذا كنت أنت مش قادر تلبس بنت واحدة اللي هي بنتك طرحة عايزنا ننزل ألبس 10 مليون طرح في البلد نفس.
Alongside Arab nationalism, the Palestinian cause became central to Nasser. With his support, the Palestine Liberation Organization was established during the Arab League Summit in Cairo in 1964. Their goals were clear: to organize Palestinian resistance against Israel. The PLO was initially led by Ahmed Shukayri, but by the end of the decade, more militant factions, like al-Fatah, gained control of the PLO, with Yasser Arafat becoming its chairman. In Israel, the toil of state-building began. They were aided by reparations from Germany and funding from individuals living in the United States, and Israel took a unique path in the Middle East. But though the most obvious divisions were between Jew and the surrounding Arab states, there were divisions among Israeli Jews themselves. Many who immigrated during earlier aliyahs were socialist, while others were quite religious. Some were from European background, some were from regions in the Middle East. Alongside them were many Christian residents and the Muslim Palestinians who still remained. To organize this diversity, the Israelis developed a parliamentary government, called the Knesset, based on the European parliamentary system. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, Israel and Arab states engaged in frequent clashes along the borders with Syria and Jordan. Clashes over water resources, like Israel's diversion of the Jordan River and Syria's counter-efforts, escalated tensions. But in May 1967, the Soviet Union falsely warned Egypt of an imminent Israeli attack on Syria. In response, Nasser moved Egyptian forces into the Sinai and blocked Israeli shipping through the Straits of Tiran, closing Israel's access to the Red Sea. Jordan and Syria soon joined Egypt in a military pact, creating a united front, while Iraq and other Arab countries pledged support. For Israel, this became an existential threat. On June 5, Israel launched a surprise airstrike against Egypt's air force, destroying over 300 Egyptian aircraft on the ground. By the end of the first day, Israel had achieved air superiority. Israeli forces then broke Nasser's blockade and advanced rapidly into the Sinai, overwhelming Egyptian troops. By June 8, Israeli forces reached the Suez Canal, capturing the entire Sinai Peninsula. In the east, Jordan began shelling Israeli cities, including West Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, but Israel responded by capturing the West Bank and East Jerusalem, including the Old City and its holy sites. On June 9 to the 10th, in the north, Israel launched an assault on the Golan Heights, a strategically important highland controlled by Syria. Despite difficult terrain and fierce Syrian resistance, Israeli forces captured the plateau. In just 6 days, Israel had tripled their territory and firmly established themselves as the dominant military power in the region. Israel suffered around 800 casualties, while Arab forces suffered around 20,000, with significant losses of equipment and territory. The Arab world in the Middle East was severely discredited and plunged into political turmoil, as Israel now controlled the West Bank, Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem, while occupying the Golan Heights and Sinai Peninsula. There was intense debate in Israel over whether the territory should be held, as it provided added security. But amidst Cold War tensions, the United States, who supported Israel, and the Soviet Union, who supported the Arab states, pushed for peace. In November, the UN passed Resolution 242, calling for Israel's withdrawal from occupied territories in exchange for peace with its neighbors. But the Arab states would still not recognize Israel. Furthermore, the issue of settlements became an obstacle. A movement developed among Israelis who advocated settling the occupied territories, particularly the West Bank, as part of the Jewish patrimony in the Holy Land. Several thousand Israeli Jews settled in the territories in the decade following the war. Settlements were also built in the Sinai, some for strategic military purposes, others for economic or religious reasons. In 1970, the Arab world was hit with another major loss. After a presidency of 14 years, Egyptian President Nasser suffered a heart attack and died. It sent shockwaves of despair throughout the Middle East. He was succeeded by his vice president and former free officer, Anwar Sadat. Sadat was more conservative than Nasser and shifted Egypt's economy away from socialism to more of a market-oriented economy based on free enterprise. As Egypt was no longer united with Syria, Sadat dropped the United Arab Republic name, replacing it with the Arab Republic of Egypt. Apart from purging Nasserism, President Sadat's main goal was to reclaim the Sinai Peninsula and restore Egypt's national pride. He would find aid with an old ally. In Syria, infighting within the ruling Ba'athist party brought Hafez al-Assad to power. Assad had been defense minister during the Six-Day War, so to restore both his own pride and that of Syria, he aimed to recover the Golan Heights. Sadat and Assad planned a surprise attack on Yom Kippur, the holiest day in Judaism, when Israel would be least prepared. Aided by both communist and Arab states, Egypt launched a well-coordinated assault across the Suez Canal, and establishing strong bridgeheads in the Sinai Peninsula. On the northern front, Syrian forces attacked the Golan Heights, initially overwhelming Israeli defenses. But the early momentum wouldn't last. Israel mobilized its reserves and launched counterattacks. Under future Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, they crossed the Suez Canal into Egyptian territory, encircling the Egyptian Third Army. On the Syrian front, Israeli forces pushed Syrian troops back from the Golan Heights and advanced toward Damascus. Both the United States and Soviet Union got involved, and again, a ceasefire was enforced by the end of October. Israel retained its territorial holdings but suffered significant casualties and losses, shaking its sense of military invincibility. It was clear with Western support, Israel couldn't be beaten militarily, so King Faisal of Saudi Arabia led some Arab OPEC nations to impose an oil embargo on the US and other countries supporting Israel, causing a global energy crisis. The result of the war set the stage for a compromise in 1978. Egyptian President Sadat and Israeli Prime Minister Menahem Begin agreed to the Camp David Accords, which set the stage for a long-lasting peace treaty a year later. Israel withdrew from the Sinai, and Egypt became the first Arab nation to recognize Israel. Both nations would establish normal diplomatic and economic relations, including the exchange of ambassadors. Israel agreed to a phased withdrawal of its military forces from parts of the West Bank and Gaza, but they did not agree to the creation of a separate Palestinian state. Many Arab nations felt betrayed, as Egypt had not secured a broader resolution to the Arab-Israeli conflict, especially regarding the Palestinian issue. Egypt was then expelled from the Arab League for a decade. Islamists viewed the deal as a surrender to Zionism and the West, and in 1981, during a parade, President Sadat was assassinated by a member of a militant Islamic group. The assassination marked a turning point in the rise of Islamist militancy in Egypt and the region. Vice President Hosni Mubarak then became Egypt's fourth president and went on to become this ancient land's longest ruler since Muhammad Ali in the early 1800s. After the Six-Day War in 1967, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians living in the West Bank fled east into Jordan, many of them becoming refugees a second time, after being displaced in the 1948 war. Here, the PLO and other Palestinian militant groups garnered more support and established bases for raids into Israel. They gained significant influence, and when radical factions tried to assassinate the Jordanian king, the PLO was expelled and they moved to southern Lebanon, location of another large Palestinian refugee population, and continued their raids.
But we did a very important thing. We create a new people, and instead of being refugees, to be fighters. This is very important. We were refugees, homeless. We became now fighters, freedom fighters. And next stage, you will see.
In 1975, Lebanon erupted into civil war, primarily between Christian militias seeking to preserve Maronite Christian dominance and a coalition of leftist Muslim factions. Israel launched a full-scale invasion into southern Lebanon in 1982, and the PLO evacuated to Tunisia. The Israeli invasion and subsequent occupation of southern Lebanon created new dynamics in the civil war, including the rise of Hezbollah, a Shia militia formed with Iranian support to resist the occupation. The civil war ended in 1990, but Israel and Syria continued their occupations until 2000 and 2005 respectively. As the situation in the West Bank and Gaza faced setback after setback, the PLO became frustrated. This led to a sustained series of protests, riots, and civil disobedience called the Intifada, or uprising. This is when a group emerged from the Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. This was Harakat al-Muqawama al-Islamiyya, or Hamas. While the PLO was the dominant political force, Hamas offered a more religious and socially conservative alternative. Peace talks occurred at the Madrid conference, marking the first time Arab and Israeli delegations sat together in an international forum. Later, the Oslo Accords in 1993 and 1995 marked the first direct agreement between Israel and the PLO. This gave Palestinians limited self-governance and administrative control in parts of the West Bank and Gaza under the Palestinian Authority, and was seen as a step toward a two-state solution. But many issues were deferred to future negotiations. Extremist groups on both sides opposed the accords. Hamas rejected the recognition of Israel, while right-wing factions in Israel viewed territorial concessions as dangerous. Terror attacks escalated, while settlements expanded, and in 1995, Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated by a Jewish extremist, weakening the momentum for peace. Soon after, a series of suicide bombings carried out by Hamas shook public confidence in the peace process. This led to the slim 1996 election victory of a security-first candidate, Benjamin Netanyahu, and there was a shift toward right-wing leadership. The same occurred in the Gaza Strip after Israel unilaterally withdrew its military and settlements in 2005. Hamas was elected in 2006 over the more secular Fatah. A brief civil war in 2007 created a division in leadership between Gaza and the Palestinian enclaves in the West Bank, which were still governed by the Palestinian Authority. While Arab nations created an oil shortage for the United States in the 1970s, Iran actually quadrupled its exports. Under Mohammad Reza Shah, Iran was a close ally of the United States. He had taken over from his father in 1941, guiding his nation to become one of the richest in the Middle East. Though ties to the US were strong, relations became strained under Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, who attempted to nationalize the oil industry in 1951. This directly threatened the dominance of Western oil companies in the region, raising fears that other nations might follow Iran's lead. The Shah's authority had weakened under Mossadegh's leadership, prompting the US and Britain to restore his power. Pahlavi was a pro-Western monarch and seen as a reliable ally for safeguarding Western interests in the Middle East, so in 1953, the CIA overthrew Mossadegh in a coup, and Pahlavi returned to power as an authoritarian ruler. The Shah's regime prioritized modernization and secularism, launching the White Revolution in 1963. Reforms granted women suffrage, and there was significant investment in education, healthcare, and public services. Major infrastructure projects, such as roads, dams, and power plants, were completed while urban centers grew rapidly, as Iran developed a robust industrial base. But many Iranians viewed the coup as a symbol of foreign intervention and betrayal. More religious conservatives also opposed some modernization efforts, like women's suffrage. The capital of Tehran became a cosmopolitan city with Western-style restaurants, theaters, and fashion trends gaining popularity. Unveiled women were allowed to roam freely and consume Western music and art, much to the dismay of more conservative elements. The Shah relied on a US-trained police force to suppress dissent, called the Savak, which used widespread surveillance, imprisonment, and torture against political opponents. The Shah was criticized for corruption and extravagant spending in the face of growing inequality. This united all forms of Iranians, from leftists to secular nationalists and conservative Islamists, the latter of which was led by Ayatollah Khomeini, a Shia cleric. He was exiled in 1964 and became the symbol of resistance against the Shah. While in exile, Khomeini's calls for an Islamic government resonated with Iranians disillusioned by westernization and inequality. Mass protests erupted in 1978 after government forces opened fire on demonstrators in Qom. Strikes, protests, and civil unrest paralyzed the country. Suffering from illness and isolation, the Shah went into exile on January 16, 1979, officially called a vacation, but he would never step foot in Iran again. He died in Egypt a year later. Ayatollah Khomeini returned from exile on February 1st and quickly consolidated power. The destabilization led to another oil crisis, sparking countries to reconsider their dependence on Middle Eastern oil. By April, Iran was declared an Islamic republic following a national referendum. The Islamic Revolution had succeeded. Soon after, political purges targeted the Shah's allies and opposition groups, including secular nationalists and leftists. The Ayatollah blamed the West, especially the United States, which was called the Great Satan, for the corruption and regression of Iranian society during the time of the Shah. Strict Islamic laws were implemented, as women were required to wear the hijab, and alcohol, gambling, and Western cultural influences were banned. On November 4th, Iranian students stormed the US Embassy in Tehran, taking 52 American diplomats and citizens hostage for 444 days. This crisis severed US-Iran relations and led to long-lasting hostility between the two nations that still continues. But Iran had enemies, not an ocean away, but right at their borders. The Soviet Union, known as the Lesser Satan, invaded Afghanistan in December 1979, just months after the Iranian Revolution. Iran strongly opposed the invasion, as it viewed Soviet intervention as a threat to its own borders and a challenge to Muslim-majority Afghanistan. The Islamic government supported the Mujahideen against the Soviets, further straining Soviet-Iranian relations. But to the west was the nation of Iraq. Iraq overthrew its monarchy in 1958, but rule was marked by instability. Like Syria, Iraq had a Ba'athist party of its own. In 1968, the party came to power in the 17th of July revolution, led by Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr and Saddam Hussein. By the late 1970s, Saddam Hussein consolidated power, becoming Iraq's president by the end of the decade. Over time, Iraqi Baathism shifted more towards Saddam's personal dictatorial and nationalist goals, viewing Assad in Syria as his main rival, and seeking to position Iraq as the dominant power in the Persian Gulf. Iraq's population included a Shia Arab majority, but its leadership was dominated by Sunni Arabs. Saddam worried that Khomeini's Islamic regime might incite Iraq's Shia population to revolt, as Khomeini called to export the Islamic Revolution. Iraq also had a large Kurdish population, which had long-standing tensions with Baghdad, and Iran supported Kurdish insurgents as a proxy against Iraq. After Iran's revolution, Saddam saw the opportunity to take advantage of the instability, and on September 22, 1980, Iraq launched a surprise invasion, targeting the oil-rich province of Khuzestan. Iran quickly regrouped under the leadership of Supreme Leader Khomeini. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or IRGC, and remnants of the regular military mounted a defense, halting Iraqi advances by early 1981. By mid-1982, Iran launched successful counteroffensives, driving Iraqi forces out of most Iranian territory. After the success, Iran decided to march into Iraq and overthrow Saddam Hussein. Soon, Iranian forces crossed into Iraq, targeting Basra and other cities. Fearing the spread of Iran's revolutionary ideology, the US began providing indirect support to Iraq. The conflict devolved into a war of attrition, with both sides digging trenches and launching costly offensives with minimal territorial gains. Similar to the trench warfare in World War I, Saddam ramped up the use of chemical weapons against Iranian troops and Kurdish civilians, leading to international condemnation. In 1986, Iranian forces captured the strategic Al-Faw Peninsula, threatening Iraqi oil exports. At this point, the US increased support for Iraq, including intelligence sharing and military equipment, and increased its naval presence to protect oil exports. After Iran was accused of mining international waters in 1988, the US Navy attacked Iranian forces during the Operation Praying Mantis. Momentum shifted once again, and Iraq launched counteroffensives, recapturing the Al-Faw Peninsula and pushing Iranian forces back. Iraq continued to use its chemical weapons and relied on superior air power to secure a more favorable position. After years of stalemate and mounting casualties, the UN brokered a ceasefire in August 1988, which both sides accepted. Both countries were exhausted after 8 years of conflict, which cost over 500,000 lives, including civilians. Neither side gained any significant territory, but were hit with massive economic losses and infrastructure, oil fields, and cities destroyed. Saudi Arabia grew wary of Iraq's ambitions and Iran's revolutionary influence. This was the case for the smaller Gulf states as well, which had gained independence from the British during the late 60s and early 70s, like Qatar and Bahrain. Saddam's regime emerged politically intact from the war, but economically bankrupt, with $80 billion in debt, much of it owed to Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. So in mid-1990, Iraqi forces crossed the border and occupied the small Gulf state. Iraq argued that Kuwait's overproduction of oil was sabotaging its economic recovery by depressing prices. They also argued historical rights to Kuwait, as it had been part of Basra province under the Ottomans, giving Saddam his means to dominate the Persian Gulf. Iraqi forces occupied Kuwait City and declared it a province of Iraq. But the United Nations condemned the invasion and imposed economic sanctions, while US President Bush declared the invasion unacceptable and assembled a coalition. This came to be known as the Gulf War and started with Operation Desert Shield, as coalition forces from 42 countries were deployed to protect Saudi Arabia from potential invasion. The UN issued Resolution 678, giving Iraq a deadline of January 15, 1991, to withdraw from Kuwait or face military action. With the deadline ignored, coalition forces launched Operation Desert Storm on January 17th, a massive air campaign targeting communication systems and military infrastructure. Iraqi army set Kuwaiti oil fields on fire, causing an environmental disaster. 600 to 700 oil wells were burned, creating fires that lasted for over 8 months. The burning of Kuwaiti oil fields caused one of the worst environmental disasters in history, creating massive pollution in the air and releasing millions of barrels of oil into the Gulf. On February 24th, the coalition launched a fierce ground offensive, and within 100 hours, Kuwait was liberated, and troops advanced into southern Iraq. To not get lost in the vast expanses of the Mesopotamian, the masses of armored vehicles used a new piece of technology. This was the Global Positioning System, GPS. Within the week, a ceasefire was declared, and Iraq agreed to a UN-brokered peace agreement. The terms kept Saddam Hussein in power, but he was required to disarm all WMDs, or weapons of mass destruction, agree to regular inspections by the UN, and pay reparations to Kuwait. The US maintained a large presence in the Gulf, establishing bases in Saudi Arabia and surrounding areas. Their presence in the kingdom angered many Muslims, including certain jihadists. Shia and Kurdish uprisings attempted to overthrow Saddam, but the regime brutally suppressed them. The United States provided little direct support, fearing the consequences of a fragmented Iraq, but Saddam's regime remained a focus of US foreign policy throughout the 1990s. Ironically, the dictator's downfall was triggered by an event not even of his own doing. The Taliban had emerged in Afghanistan in the early 1990s, following the withdrawal of Soviet forces and the collapse of the pro-Soviet government. The Islamic State of Afghanistan was established in 1992, but was plagued by infighting among the Mujahideen factions, leading to a civil war. The Taliban were primarily religious students, many educated in Pakistani madrasas, who sought to end the chaos of the civil war and establish their own Islamic state. Saudi Arabia, along with other Gulf states, funded madrasas that taught a hardline Wahhabi version of Islam, which influenced the Taliban's ideology. They presented themselves as a purer, less corrupt alternative to the warlords and Mujahideen factions, who were perceived as corrupt and divisive. The militant organization quickly gained territory, and by 1996, the Taliban controlled Kabul and most of the country, establishing the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. The Taliban provided sanctuary for a wealthy Saudi Arabian, Osama bin Laden, that had joined the Afghan resistance in the 1980s. He had provided financial support, recruited fighters, and established the Al-Qaeda organization in 1988 as a network to support Mujahideen fighters and advance global jihad. After the Gulf War, bin Laden fell out of favor with the Saudi government after they allowed the deployment of US troops.
We have focused declaration of jihad on striking at the U.S. soldiers inside Arabia, the country of the two holy places, Mecca and Medina.
He saw the presence of foreign troops in the land of Islam's holiest sites as a desecration and betrayal. Public denouncements of the royal family led to bin Laden losing his citizenship and fleeing the country. After traveling to Sudan in 1992, he made it a base for the Al-Qaeda organization to train militants, plan operations, and network with other jihadist groups. In 1996, bin Laden relocated to Afghanistan, where the Taliban provided him sanctuary. The Taliban allowed Al-Qaeda to operate training camps and use Afghanistan as a base in exchange for financial and ideological support. Saudi Arabia officially opposed Al-Qaeda but inadvertently contributed to its rise through their spread of Wahhabism. Under bin Laden's leadership, Al-Qaeda orchestrated major terrorist attacks, including the 1998 US Embassy bombings and the infamous 9/11 attacks. The attacks prompted a US invasion of Afghanistan in October 2001 to dismantle Al-Qaeda. The secondary goal was to remove the Taliban from power and create a more moderate allied government. But as the Soviets learned 20 years prior, Afghanistan had earned its reputation as a money pit, and the Americans would spend nearly 2 decades attempting to consolidate their position. The US-led invasion then turned into a global war on terror. In March 2003, US-led forces launched an invasion of Iraq, and Saddam Hussein and the Ba'athist regime was removed from power permanently, unleashing a wave of instability, sectarian violence, and the rise of groups like ISIS. The Arab Spring in the 2010s led to widespread uprisings, toppling regimes in Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, and Yemen, but also triggered a prolonged civil war in Syria, with devastating humanitarian consequences. The Assad government in Syria continued under Bashar al-Assad. But the very same day this video was being written, there have been reports that Damascus has fallen. Meanwhile, shifting alliances, such as growing Iranian influence, normalization of relations between Israel and some Arab states, and escalating tensions between regional powers, will tell the tale of whether this cradle of civilization will become its graveyard.